Adversaries are relentless, and they're only getting smarter, faster, and more sophisticated. Knowing their game is the only way to beat them. That's why we're here. Learn what it takes to protect against even the most sophisticated attacks. Welcome to the Adversary Universe podcast.
All right, welcome to another episode of the Adversary Universe podcast. I'm your host, Adam Myers, and Christian Rodriguez is nowhere to be found today. So we will proceed without him, and we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic with CrowdStrike Intelligence, Joel Snape, who is been looking at a phenomena of these various proxy botnets that are out there. When an adversary wants to target an organization, they want to look like they're coming from the geographic region. They want to be coming off of perhaps a regional or local ISP, and it makes it a more compelling story, and it maybe increases the time before they get caught by the defenders. So we're going to dive into that. And Joel, you've been doing this talk now at Falcon and a couple of other places, and I think it's been really well received. So excited to have you on the podcast here today. Why don't you go ahead and just give us a quick intro?
Cool. Yeah, sure. So my name is Joel. I've been doing cybersecurity for nearly 15 years. I started out in like the telco space, so networking and network security has always been kind of close to my heart. But CrowdStrike has been fantastic, and it's been really interesting to kind of merge the two worlds a little bit and see it from the point of view of both the organization and the network a little bit.
And what fascinates you about the telco space or the network space?
Oh, well, it's going to sound really geeky, but the thing is, it just blows my mind that you could be sitting there in the US, right? And you could be putting a signal on a wire, and that signal is coming out. So I'm based in the UK, as you probably guessed from the accent, but that signal is coming out on a wire or through a radio perfectly in my room here in the UK. And the fact that we can do that at the scale that we do it at just blows my mind every time I kind of think about it.
Yeah, it's especially for those of us that remember back in the day where you would have to dial up with a modem and you get there like you're like this would have been coming through one stream, like one row at a time. And so it's amazing. You get fiber optic to your house and get gig speed internet. I remember the first time I saw gig speed internet, or gig speed anything, it was on a switch. So yeah, it's pretty cool. And you've been doing this for how long, CrowdStrike?
I've been CrowdStrike 3 years now. So I got my 3-year wings 2 weeks ago, I think.
Congratulations! We like to give these wings out to people after significant periods of time, and I think that 3 year is one of the first big ones that you got. So congrats!
Yeah,
I'm coming up on 15, so we'll see where they go.
Yeah, I think CrowdStrike was founded around the time I was starting out in the industry, so I've been kind of watching it through my career, which has been quite interesting.
And what did you do before CrowdStrike?
I spent most of my time working for a telco in the UK called BT, or they're an international telco, and I ran various incident response cases for them, which was super interesting because obviously we were targeted by some interesting groups. And then I moved into doing more in terms of implementing defenses and doing analytics at kind of internet scale against some of the data we could collect.
Were you always on the security side, or did you start off as like a telco nerd?
Well, I joined out of university, so I got a background in electronics, and this was kind of before the term cybersecurity existed, right? So they said we need some people to do network security, and I sort of, I was sort of a little bit interested, and I said, yeah, sure, I'll do network security, and it kind of turned into a really interesting role looking at how we manage the risks of some of the vendors we used. Probably won't name names, but you can guess which ones we might have been thinking about, and there was more than one, there were a few.
Huawei?
Well, that might have been one, obviously, and yeah, others that we also had risks from in different degrees and different kinds of risks. And how do you, manage a network that's critical to the national interests, national security, and manage some of those risks that using vendors from other jurisdictions brings about. And then from there into incident response, and then from there into doing sort of more implementation of network defense. So yeah, it was a really interesting time. It taught me a lot.
Did you cut your teeth running cable and doing telco stuff too, or
I have done that, yeah, because we used to run a lab, and that was so obviously there's before, when you're running a big critical network, you have to integrate all of the stuff. You have to understand how it works, and if you're going to be doing security testing against it, then you probably don't want to be doing that in the live network that's handling emergency calls and real internet traffic. So yeah, I've done some 50 volt DC cabling in my time.
Oh yeah. little with the 110 tool and the 66 tool and
Well,
yeah.
yeah, it was all like Ethernet and whatever by the time I was there, so that
Okay.
was easy.
You POTS guys, POTS being
That's all
cleanly
going.
full.
Well, the thing was that the POTS is always going away in about 2 years' time, but it's been going away in about 2 years' time for as long as anyone can remember. So I think it'll be around
Almost
for a
as
little
long as
bit.
IPv4 has been going away.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same kind of thing. Right?
And so you got into network security, you got into that, and then let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing from the proxies. How'd you get hip to that?
Well, so obviously we at CrowdStrike spent a lot of time tackling Scattered Spider, and some of the, we know that they're very effective, and I think you've talked about it on the podcast before. One of the things that caught our eye was some of the network infrastructure they were using to access victims, because like you said in the intro, if you're trying to log onto a company's VPN or trying to access some of their cloud environments, often if you do that from somewhere that stands out as being anomalous, you'll get caught. So what they were after, and what lots of other adversaries are after, is access points onto the internet that blend in with legitimate traffic. So you're talking about home ADSL connections in the US, home mobile connections in the US as well, potentially, depending on what it is you're trying to do. And NSOX was one of the providers of those that we spotted they used. And so, I mean, it wasn't just me, right? There's a big team. We've got some, extremely capable analysts. I'm very fortunate to work with so many great people here. And we decided to dig into it a little bit more so that we could understand how it worked and try and see if we could track it a little bit better so that we could be a bit more proactive in terms of spotting activity coming out of it.
No, they target a lot of routers or I guess internet devices, right? Like
yes,
those routers or those home internet devices.
Well, there's a whole variety of stuff.
What kind of stuff do you see them targeting?
They target a whole mix of stuff. There is obviously home routers, but one of the other things we spotted were things like NAS devices. So people who stick a NAS device on the internet so they can watch their movies from the hotel or whatever. We also spotted things like UPS devices where they're connected to the internet. And I think cameras as well was another big class of device.
So Internet of Things.
Internet of Things, yeah.
The Internet of somebody else's things.
Yeah, and it's as soon as you connect these things up, you kind of forget that they're obviously you don't have like a patching cadence. A lot of the stuff that they were using was known, but there was also some stuff that wasn't previously known that was 0 day, and they put a lot of effort into researching that themselves, or at least they claimed that they put a lot of effort into researching that themselves.
Well, I think that's the first big takeaway for anybody listening. As you continue listening to the rest of this podcast, go update your package libraries and make sure all your devices are patched up, because we see adversaries routinely exploiting these vulnerabilities. And so what are some of the vulnerabilities that are most prevalent, or is it authentication issues like admin?
That's certainly one class, yeah. But there's a whole other class which is probably pretty basic, kind of 1990s level vulnerabilities that are still out there in these kind of embedded devices. So it might be things like command injection into web management interfaces. That's quite a common one. In some cases, it might be things like a Stack Overflow or whatever. But to be honest, there's so much low-hanging fruit out there that really we're still at that kind of class of basic security issue. And things are improving. Like vendors are definitely improving, and I've seen that myself over the last 5-10 years. But I think there's still a way to go, and there's still a lot of this stuff out there on the internet.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. Like you go to so many different places, hotels and cafes and stuff like that, and these devices have default passwords, right? And it's madness that they haven't been more badly compromised than they have. That maybe speaks to the fact that there's such a wide target-rich environment out there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this comes back to the issue of trying to disrupt some of this stuff. You can do what you can do, but unless the root cause is addressed, and I know there's lots of programs to address it in the UK through like Secure by Design, and in the US through some of the stuff that CISA's doing. Until we address that, we're going to be stuck in this situation.
Well, and I guess Secure by Design in that case means having the default password being like the serial number or something. So it's not easy.
And there's some mandating around providing security updates for a certain period of time or the lifetime of the device. And there's a whole set of like design criteria around that.
And so most of them probably Linux devices, right? So we're talking about a lot of Linux binaries, and just does it just open it up as a proxy, or how does that?
It's quite interesting. There's been some design effort put into it. At a very high level, what they would do is they would come along and exploit a vulnerability. They would then drop a web shell onto the box, which required a kind of key to access it. And in some cases, we also saw them patching the vulnerabilities so that nobody else could come along and steal their device off them. They would then use the web shell to deploy their payload. And what their payload would do would be to connect back to them and open up, like you say, that proxy tunnel. If you're a customer of the network, you then buy access, you connect to one of the NSOC servers, that forwards your traffic onto one of the devices, the device you bought, and you access the internet as if you were, in that house connected to that ADSL network.
Does the victim have any visibility into this? Does their connection slow down?
I mean, the connection might slow down, you're right. And they'll probably reboot the router. And then at that point, the infection will go away, but they'll come back a few days later and reinfect the device or use the web shell to drop their payload back on it again. So I can imagine there's lots of very frustrated householders who keep rebooting their router. It fixes it for a few days and then it comes back.
So they're not persisting through a reboot?
It depends on the device. But yeah, in a lot of these cases, these kind of embedded devices, it's quite difficult to update the firmware and you don't want to risk bricking the device. So the payload tends to not be persistent. But the vulnerability is persistent.
As long as they don't patch it.
Well, yeah. So the patching is, the patching is kind of done dynamically, I suppose, as well. Often it goes away on reboot.
Oh, I see. So they patch it. So
it might be like a,
and then, okay. And then it reboots and they lose their connection and okay. And so are they like mass scanning? How are they finding targets?
So they had a set of servers, and it seemed to us like the servers were targeted to particular devices. So one server might scan for 2 or 3 different device types, and they would drop the payload from these exploitation servers. We don't know for sure how they get the initial list of devices to target, but it's quite reasonable to assume that they might use some of the big open source data sets that are out there from internet scanning rather than doing their own scanning. But that's not something we dug into in a huge amount of detail. We know that they can find this stuff. They can find it pretty quickly. So we would put up vulnerable devices. We would see them come along a few days later and exploit them and drop their payload.
And were you seeing like the scan on those devices or not?
The trouble is, the internet's so noisy that there's a lot of scanning activity going on, and it's hard to distinguish what might have been them from, all of the other people that are scanning. We scan too, right?
Right, all the other scans going on. We do enterprise attack surface management, which you want to scan to understand where your exposures are, where your vulnerabilities are, and what your attack surface looks like. So it's certainly a viable thing that a lot of organizations do and do it to protect themselves.
Yeah.
But in this case, the bad guy's doing it to find devices in your house that they could pop to use for various schemes. Well, I think we'll come back to that in a second. But once the device gets compromised, is it now beaconing back to a command and control server?
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting the way that it worked, because the problem with these kind of embedded devices is that they're often running really old versions of things like OpenSSL or the various libraries to do TLS, which is what protects things like, when you're doing your normal browsing. And because it's so old, it's very difficult to make it work properly. So they actually rolled their own scheme where the implant would do a DNS query, so it'd do a lookup for a domain to get an IP address to connect to. But it would also do, there's another kind of DNS lookup which returns some text. So you could do a DNS record to look up to turn a domain into an IP address. You can also do a DNS lookup to turn a domain into some text, and that's used for various different parts of securing the internet. They used it to deliver a signature that they could use to validate the IP address. So instead of using TLS or HTTPS, they'd rolled their own kind of scheme to validate that they were talking to who they should be talking to. And that made it hard for anyone to, intercept or sinkhole that communication, because they've got some validation that they are actually talking to their servers. So that was quite neat. And then, like you say, the implant will connect back to we call them the back connect servers. That's what the actor called them as well.
So device is vulnerable, adversary finds a vulnerability, exploits it, drops a web shell. Web shell probably pulls down a binary of some sort.
Yeah, that's right. They use the web shell to pull down a binary from one of their servers. And binary...
So is that like compiled from MIPS and ELF and all kinds of different...
Exactly. Yeah. It's very architecture dependent. ARM, MIPS. There were a couple of x86 ones as well, because they were exploiting some services that ran on x86 too. So they had the whole lot.
Okay. And when you look at those different binaries, and kind of compare them, they're all kind of... You think they're cross-compiled, or you think they're uniquely built for each platform?
It'll be a common code base that's cross-compiled, yeah. And we can see similarities between the different architectures.
Oh, very cool. Okay, so now this binary instantiates and it starts doing this DNS magic to get the text record to find a key, and then it establishes communication. And now is there just one main kind of communication, or is it like a cluster of nodes?
It's kind of, yeah, it is two-stage. So the first one it connects to, so it connects to an IP address on port 443. So it looks like it's connecting to just a normal website, but actually it's their own kind of protocol that they've written that tells the implant where to connect to next to connect to their back connect servers, and that lets them do a little bit of load balancing. But there is a one-to-one, it is just a one-way communication between the implant and their back connect server.
But they can make it resilient because
they can make it resilient. Yeah. So there's multiple layers of resiliency in the network. It's quite well engineered, to be honest.
Okay. And so now this connection's established, and now I, as a potential customer, let's kind of maybe shift gears here. Yeah. So I, as a potential customer, I'm running a business email compromise scheme, and I want to come out of a residential residential IP space in Virginia. So how do I do that? Not that we're going to tell everybody how to.
I was going to say, I'm not going to trail the site. I'm not going to.
Yeah, we're not making that
free advertising. An alternative, as they say in the UK, alternative VPN providers are available. What you do is you go to their website, and they have a listing showing. They don't show you exactly what the IP address is, obviously, because that's kind of the thing they want to hide a little bit until you've paid.
Right,
you sign up, you deposit some funds with them, and you can see a list of the available proxies, and you can filter them by country. By region, you can filter them by type. So you could say, you could be really specific. You can say, I want a mobile IP address in Chicago. I want residential landline in DC. I want something in Cambridge in the UK. Once you've selected it, you pay, and you pay based on the kind of quality of the connection, I suppose. So that it ranges from somewhere between 40 cents up to $1.50. So it's actually really cheap, and that'll get you 24 hours of access.
Is that based off of ping response or what?
Yeah, and the speed, I think, anyway, the speed and the ping response. There's some kind of mechanism for calculating that.
And how do they get a mobile? Are they hitting a handset, or is this like something behind a mobile?
I think it's something behind a mobile connection, somewhere with one of those sort of travel routers or hotspots like that. Well, I have to say we have a good understanding of a lot of the network, but we don't have a full understanding of every class of device they exploit. There's just too many.
Okay, so and in terms of payment, is this Bitcoin?
I would have to check, actually. There certainly is Bitcoin. I think there was Litecoin as well. But they give you a wallet address, and you deposit funds into that wallet. Once their system has seen that those funds have arrived, you can use them to spend on access.
And it's a unique wallet per customer, I'm assuming?
Yes, it's a unique wallet per customer.
Okay. And then so that kind of charges up your account, and then you can start to burn it down. And then I presume there's a UI that you could kind of use to get where you want to be coming out of and what type of device?
They give you some connection details, and then you have to configure your browser to use those. So they give you an IP address and a port, and you configure your browser to use those as a proxy. And then there's a mapping in their system between that port and the endpoint you want to come out of.
So you're not directly connecting to
You're not directly connecting to the endpoint. No, you're connecting to their backnet, one of their proxy servers, and then that routes you to the right destination, and you come out of, Chicago or wherever.
And what happens if it fails? Like if that Chicago connection goes down? Does it expose the adversary's true IP address at all?
I think it's more likely their browser would just fail to connect.
Okay.
But it is reliant on people configuring their setup properly, and that's, can be difficult, and people do trip up that way, for sure.
And how many? How big would you estimate the victims are? Like how many systems?
So I was looking at it earlier, and it's about, they advertise anyway, and obviously you have to take into account that the advertisement could be false, but we believe it to be broadly correct. They advertise 30,000 endpoints at the moment, so
wow. It's a lot of compromise.
It's pretty big, yeah. So there's about 20,000 in the US, which is obviously shows how. In the US.
So 2/3 of all of their estate is in the US, huh?
At the moment, yeah. As of today. And it's quite dynamic, it changes. And so there was the takedown and the number did drop off, but it's built back up steadily over the last couple of months. And I do have to say that we have to take that with a pinch of salt. It is what they're advertising, and there's no guarantee that all of those are currently available.
Right.
But certainly before the takedown, we believed the figures were roughly accurate.
Well, we've mentioned the takedown twice now. What's the story with the takedown?
So in towards the end of 2024, the one thing I didn't mention when we were talking about the C2 is they actually use a DGA algorithm, so a domain generation algorithm for their domains, and each implant has a way of calculating 1,000 domains, and it iterates through those domains to find the one that's in use. But obviously, if that kind of signature validation that I spoke about failed, it doesn't use it. But
domain generating algorithm, just for anybody that's listening and never heard that term before, is when the implant can kind of generate these domains in a predictable way, so that you know over time or over some sort of iteration which domain it's going to choose in the future, so that you can kind of avoid domains being blocked or taken down or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea is that if one domain gets taken down, the implant can choose the next one in the list. And the list in this case is generated by having some random phrases or words, and they're kind of mashed together based on a starting seed number.
Right.
So we've mentioned the takedown a couple of times. So towards the end of 2024, there was an operation within the industry to take down the botnet, and they seized a lot of the DGA domains, almost all of the DGA domains, I think, that were being used by the most common implants as part of the botnet. And what that meant is that you've got a router with the implant running on it, for example, and that implant can no longer connect back to the back connect servers or the adversary's infrastructure. However,
like sync hold or something.
Yeah, exactly. So they got sync hold, and it let them gather some telemetry, I guess, on the size of the network and things like that. The adversary that runs the network posted on their kind of news page saying that they were under attack, and the stuff had been taken down, and that they also claimed they were being put under a DDoS attack. But obviously we don't know how true that is. They did make lots of claims like that to kind of
losing all your domains might seem like a DDoS attack.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think they used that as an excuse for when things weren't running well in the past anyway. If they had technical issues, they just blame a DDoS attack. But they also were quite clear that they were going to try and work around it and come back, and it seems like they have been able to do that over the last few months. So we have seen continued exploitation that follows the pattern of what we've seen, although we've seen some slight changes in how they actually drop the payloads. Looking at what they advertise, we've seen those numbers creep back up again.
Yeah, unfortunately, as we've seen before with lots of these disruption activities, is that you need to also take the humans off the field. Yes. When that's happening. So the concern there is you could disrupt the domains, and you could take out all of the that infrastructure. But if the devices are still vulnerable, if people still have password or 1234 is their password, then these adversaries just need to spin it back up, and they're back to the races.
That's exactly right. So until we tackle that root cause, and it's going to take time for this stuff to kind of move through the pipeline, for it to become end of life and be removed from people's homes and networks, but we are on that trajectory, and I think the point is about how we manage that risk while that stuff is out there.
When you mentioned their website that you go to sign up for one of these proxies, was that disrupted?
I don't believe it was. No.
Seems like that would be the one to disrupt, right? That would put them out of business.
Sure, and they did talk, yeah. And but what would happen, right? They would rebrand. They would come back as something else. It would be,
right,
a different kind of socks rather than socks.
Now, we've seen ones before that had a legitimate looking storefront and a legitimate VPN business, but They were on the back end. They were doing this stuff unbeknownst to their users. So does NSOX do that, or was this clearly just a we're up to no good and you're up to no good, so why don't you use us and we'll be up to no good together?
I mean, I think if you didn't ask yourself the question too hard, you could convince yourself that it was legitimate. There's nothing, saying that it's illegitimate, and they have claimed at times that it is legitimate. But I think
just want to watch Netflix while I'm in Europe.
Yeah, exactly right. But if you think about it, that you're not going to be able to build a network this size through entirely legitimate means, although there are people out there who do manage it. But from the investigation we did, we were pretty clear that at least some of this was accessed illegitimately.
So it's not NSOX and chill? It's not their advertising? Okay. Maybe we can make some shirts for Falcon or something like NSOX and chill.
NSOX and chill. That would be pretty cool.
We're kind of getting close to the end of the time here, but what do you think, where are they located, these adversaries? Who's behind NSOX, if you had to guess?
We have some ideas, and it's something we would like to continue investigating for sure. And we've got some work to do.
And how big do we think the market is for this type of service?
Well, it's clearly in demand. The fact that he built it back up again. There are a number of competitors as well. And what was really interesting was that we started to see a bit of a turf war between the operators of these networks trying to grab each other's devices. People think there's money to be made there, and they are making money. And I think the other thing to say is that it's not just e-crime actors that are after this kind of stuff. We know, for example, that Fancy Bear we published some stuff on this last year, Fancy Bear using networks of devices that have been compromised, so where people hadn't patched those, and then the Fancy Bear was able to take advantage of those. And we know that the various kind of different Panda adversaries that we track use similar kinds of networks that are built for them. Again, made up of the Orb networks, yeah, absolutely, made up of compromised home routers in most cases. So there clearly is demand out there, and that demand's not going to go away.
This has been going on for a while. I remember there was one even back in like 2000. Say like 8 or 9, I remember looking at, where it was malware that was a reverse proxy. We would infect a host and like kind of monitor the traffic, because it wasn't so much local or specific to an IP address. It was just kind of a reverse proxy network. And you would see, I mean, all these kind of, it was like online dating scams, like mail order bride type scams that were going on, and business email compromise type scams going on. So you could actually watch this coming out of the endpoint. And it was wild to see. So this is something that's been around for a while, I'd say. But also it's interesting that nation state threat actors see the value in this, and they're building their own and not leveraging something like this because they want the control over it. And also, you mentioned that they're fighting for the same real estate effectively. It sounds kind of like, if you remember back in the Mirai days.
Yeah, because Mirai was open sourced, and then everyone was suddenly running a DDoS botnet, and that worked for a while. And then the internet learned how to mitigate some of those threats, and organizations learned how to mitigate those. And I guess people moved to where the money is, and the money right now is in getting access to organizations.
Well, I think it comes back to identity, which we've talked about on this podcast before, which is, if you compromise a legitimate account, one of the things that the good guys look for is, okay, Joel's coming in. He usually comes in from the UK, but now he's coming in from Antananarivo or something like that, and so that's probably not really Joel. So now, like, the threat actor knows who you are. They've stolen your identity, and then they just find even in the same town that you're coming out of, and it makes it harder to identify through kind of time travel techniques that we've used for many years. So I think there's some real concern about why these things exist and what we could do to stop them. So what are your thoughts on kind of moving forward, right? So you've done this presentation at a few events now. You spoke at Falcon Europe, and covered off this one proxy net, and there's others out there. What would you like to see happen? What's kind of the next step from your perspective?
Well, I think there's got to be an awareness that you can't just ban parts of the internet because they happen to be in a certain area. That's not effective anymore, and you need to be focusing on thinking more about the behaviors that the accounts are doing, and you need to be thinking about how can we identify when a legitimate account is doing something out of the ordinary. So it does come back to identity again, like you say, and it's about how do you identify anomalous behavior from an account rather than treating this bit of the internet as bad or these IP addresses as bad, because that doesn't scale anymore.
And so what are some techniques we think people would want to use to kind of identify when there's a reverse proxy or local proxy being used to log in?
Well, it's about what the account does after it logs in, right? So, I'm Joel, I work in the sales team, I log in, and every day I do X, Y, and Z. But then suddenly one day I log in and do something completely different. And it's about how do you have the technology in place to monitor that activity and to alert on things that stand out as being anomalous or suspicious, either when they're doing it as the account or once they've started accessing devices and services, within your environment.
Behavioral anomalies.
Exactly. Like yeah. And I guess that's kind of been our motto ever since CrowdStrike was founded. It's not about spotting point indicators, it's about spotting behaviors that are anomalous or incorrect.
Malware problem, an adversary problem.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I think that it's what you said at the start, 15 years since you started out in CrowdStrike, and I think that's as relevant now as it was then, and we just keep finding that in different ways.
Well, more so too, because I think malware has become increasingly less important. Every year we put out the Global Threat Report, and we see hands-on keyboard activity going up and up and up, and 70%, 80% of the intrusions have hands-on keyboard activity, and that's, a threat actor maybe, and we've seen this over the last couple of years, it's really moved to identity. So they come in with a compromised identity, and then they're not bringing malware, they're using Microsoft Edge to interact with a SharePoint server or go into something, and then once they want to actually launch their next phase, they're deploying a remote monitoring and management tool. And so, by blending in, I think your point's spot on, that we need to be thinking about those behaviors and trying to correlate that to the user, and make sure that we understand where that variance is, so that we could kind of investigate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So anything, any parting words, anything that you'd like to convey about your research with NSOCs or your experience looking at that?
It's something we're going to continue looking into, and we're digging into some of the other networks as well. And I guess people will see that insight come out in the future through talks and through some of our product.
Well, hey, thank you so much, and it was a pleasure talking to you today. And wanted to express that just admiration for what you're doing and the level of detail you go into looking at these threats and understanding how these proxy networks work. And a lot of people don't understand that how many hours would you say you've spent looking at NSOCs, for example?
It's been quite a lot of hours, I would say. But yeah, I'd have to think about the exact number.
I'm sure not insignificant, when you think about the hours and hours and hours you spend looking at the infrastructure and the binaries and everything else. So
the other thing to stress is it's a team effort, right? So it's not just me. There's been a lot of other analysts, both doing technical analysis and also, more on the investigating how it's sold and advertised and that kind of stuff. It's definitely a team effort, and across all of us, yeah, you're right. It's been a reasonable effort.
Well, shout out to the team. Thanks everybody for the hard work. This has been another episode of the Adversary Universe podcast. I think maybe we'll get Christian Rodriguez, Field CTO of the Americas, back for the next one. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to our podcast and head over to crowdstrike.com/adversaries to learn more about the many bad guys we track. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Adversary Universe podcast.